Hey, everybody, and welcome back to Professional Development, the New York City Teacher Podcast. I'm your host, Noah, and this week I'm very pleased to bring you our guest, Dr. Kelly Parks, who is the chair of the Arts and Humanities Department, as well as the director of the Music and Music Education program at Teachers College, Columbia University, here in New York City. Dr. Parks writes prolifically on the subject of teacher preparation, which is the context in which we met, as Dr. Parks is one of the professors who was responsible for preparing me to teach. She joins us today to discuss the edTPA, one of several tests required for teacher certification in the state of New York. Dr. Parks, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks very much for having me. I'm really excited to talk about edTPA today.
One of the primary purposes of this show is to bring the voices of teachers and people sort of adjacent to the profession of teaching back into the conversation about teaching, which is often, unfortunately, devoid of teacher voices and the voices of people who are involved in teaching and preparing teachers as well. So to start off, could you tell us a little bit about how you got into the teaching game and also your transition into teacher preparation?
Sure. Thanks. That's a really good question. For me, obviously, I was not born in America. I grew up in Australia, and so was teaching middle school band and also playing my instrument, which is the trumpet, in our National Symphony Orchestra before I came to the US. So I had a background in teaching middle school instrumental music in Australia and some high school music as well. And then I sort of moved tracks a little bit to continue my education over in the US. So I did another degree in teaching and then a doctorate in instrumental pedagogy, so a PhD in music education. So that both those degrees afforded me experiences where I could learn about how does music education happen in the US, which is different to how it happens in Australia. So my first job out of graduate school, obviously in graduate school, I was a teaching assistant and I supervised student teachers, so I could go out into the field and watch what students were doing in Florida. And that really helped me understand that, the differences acutely between Australia and the US in terms of music education, but also allowed me to see into hundreds of classrooms across my 2 degrees. So when I finished my doctorate, I got a job teaching at a university, as you do, and I specifically took a job that would allow me to help continue to prepare teachers. So that meant supervising them in the field, teaching classes, and ensuring that they were ready for the jobs ahead of them in Virginia. And Virginia has a slightly different system to New York, where in preparing teachers, you can prepare them in different tracks. So some folks have to take more choral classes, voice classes, and other people take more instrumental. So you can sort of specialize a little way, which is different to the US. So that's how I got into teacher education, having been a teacher, a music teacher, studying sort of the pedagogies, and then doing that work at university at that level in Virginia before coming to New York, where interestingly, right at around the time when I was really getting interested in edTPA, New York was one of the first states that adopted or was asked or made to adopt the edTPA, and I thought I was very lucky in Virginia because we were not adopting edTPA at that time as part of teacher preparation.
Has Virginia since adopted it, or has it continued to sort of go its own way without edTPA?
Oh, I think it's still managing quite fine without edTPA. I think some schools have opted to trial. Universities can opt to do that, but it's not required, I don't think, by the state in the way it is in New York.
Excellent. Okay, so for the non-teachers in the audience, of which there are a few, and for teachers who might have gotten certified before edTPA was a thing, could you tell us in layman's terms what edTPA is all about?
Well, edTPA, so that's an acronym, and it's the first 2 letters are small E, small d, and then TPA. And TPA stands for Teaching Performance Assessment. So it's basically a way to measure, purportedly, students who are preparing to be teachers, their readiness to move into the classroom after graduation. So it's positioned sort of as a final test almost of what folks are learning in their teacher preparation programs in order to be ready for the field. At least that's what edTPA says it is. I, as you know, don't think it does that at all. But it consists of folks who are doing their student teaching experience, which is an experience where they learn alongside a licensed teacher, an experienced teacher. They're placed in that classroom, and the idea is that they complete this performance assessment in that setting where they write their lesson plans, they write about their teaching, they film their teaching, they look at the film of their teaching, and they reflect about their teaching and about the learning of their students. So it's sort of designed as a portfolio in that there's artefacts that are submitted and there's reflection that is submitted, and then it's scored by a team of scorers sort of at a standardised way across the different content areas.
Are the scorers all music teachers, or are they teachers from other fields as well?
So when edTPA first came out, I signed up to be a scorer to try to understand that as well. It's like, I'll learn to score music, these portfolios. And as it turns out, the ones that the music teachers do are underneath a subheading of performance. So in the performing arts, that includes things like dance, drama, theatre, music. So it's not unlikely that they would get a portfolio not in their specific discipline, but that there are rubrics that you follow to look for a preponderance of evidence in the work submitted across the performing arts in general. There are, some sort of specific language that we would use in music that perhaps dancers wouldn't use. But yeah, I was not always just scoring music portfolios. So my sense is that still continues, that folks are still scoring in the performing arts, but across those disciplines.
Gotcha. And did you get a sense when you were training as a scorer of the types of individuals who were involved in that training and going on presumably to become professional scorers for the edTPA?
Yeah, well, lots of the folks who were going through the training, at least when I did, and this was probably 5 or 6, maybe even 7 years ago now. Time goes very quickly. That it was retired teachers that were retired from the classroom, that had been cooperating teachers, that had student teachers in their classrooms working with them, so had a sense of the setting. Often it was also folks like me, people at university who were trying to understand what was this new thing that our students were going to have to be required to pass and used as a sort of a high stakes almost a barrier in some ways into the field, because if it is required by many states, and if you don't pass it, then you can't get your license to teach. You either have to take the test again, the assessment again, or you can apply for a safety net. So mostly retired teachers, some current teachers in K-12 settings, lots of current higher education teachers. But folks that had taught or were teaching in those disciplines or content areas.
Okay, so mostly people involved in education and some aspect of their career, not people that they were bringing in off the street.
No. Everyone that they did have a set of criteria that had to be either be a current teacher, either teaching, currently in schools. Or currently working in higher education, or had a resume that indicated, a wealth of experience in doing either of those things.
Okay, well, that's somewhat reassuring. It could always be worse. You mentioned that the edTPA is a barrier, as something that you have to pass in several states in order to become a teacher. and then if you don't pass, you have to take it again, or take a safety net. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, sure. The safety net is another type of test where you write about your teaching. So it still allows the state to see that you know what you're talking about. You know, you can identify things in a lesson plan. You can identify student learning outcomes. You can see the outcomes in children. And the safety net test is just a different type of test where you write about teaching, similar to the edTPA, where you write about your lesson plans and you write about what you're seeing in your videos and you write about what you're seeing in your student data. It's different. It's not like having someone come into the classroom and seeing you do those things. It's sort of staged into the 3 discrete areas in edTPA. So that's the test. You can't. You have to upload things in those 3 areas sort of separately, but it's still writing about your teaching, and that's similar to what the safety net test is as well.
Okay, so I'm getting a couple of threads here that I think are very interesting when talking about a test supposedly of teacher performance. So the action word that I'm hearing is writing as opposed to teaching. So and also this idea of uploading 3 separate sections. And when I think about my teaching day, like the course of my day as a teacher, I don't see many occasions in which there are 3 discrete sections to what I'm doing. It would be very difficult for me to take a snapshot of any given period of time in the day and say like, oh yeah, that was a blank period of time. Like that was an assessment moment, or that was there's really a lot of overlap. So, so first, this question of writing, how is it that that writing is such a central focus of this assessment, whereas in teaching it is a very small, relatively piece of the teaching day?
Well, I think part of it is the standardized nature of the test. So it needs to be put into a format that can be scored. So when we think about how essays are scored, you know, when we think about SATs and GREs and those type of big standardized tests, there is a qualitative component, you know, which involves expressing oneself, and there are some mechanics of writing that are always, you know, helpful that you want teachers to be able to do. And it's just a sort of a more sort of uniform way of finding out what people think about their teaching. So it's different to a student teaching observation when someone comes in and has a chat to you and talks about what are you planning on doing and what am I going to see today, and observing it in real time. It's different because in having students write about what are they planning, and then having them write about what they see in their videos, and then again what they are seeing in their student learning, is a barrier in some respects, because, you know, folks might be very gifted and responsive in the classroom to their students, but they may not be able to write about it. So in that way, I see it as a barrier. And also, you know, English is not everyone's first language in the US. And sure, everyone's, let's say, in undergraduate or graduate education. But, you know, we're not measuring how well people can write. We should be measuring how well they can teach, which traditionally had been measured in the student teaching experience by both the university facilitator coming out to help mentor and help the student, and also by the cooperating teacher who is there as a mentor and as the model for the pre-service teacher to learn from. So an additional step of having to write about it, sure, might seem easy to have a systematic, standardized way of measuring across. But it's interesting in the way that it's measured, the rubrics that the scorers are, you know, asked to use, are looking for evidence in the writing, you know, so evidence of use of theory, or evidence of, you know, using assessment in the classroom, or evidence of knowledge of students. So it is asking, in a way, the pre-service teacher to illustrate the thinking behind their planning or the thinking behind what they're doing in the classroom. And that step it's not without its merit. That is a useful step for pre-service teachers to be undergoing. But I don't know whether we should be using it as a final summative gateway into the profession, because it doesn't really show necessarily readiness. It shows how well you can look at your teaching and write about it, whether or not it's good teaching or not good teaching.
Right. And I'm thinking of examples in which that would be useful once you're teaching. And reflection is very important, but writing about your teaching, I think the only time in which that would come in handy is if you get an observation report that you're not pleased with, and then you have to advocate for yourself to move from a 3 to a 4 or a 2 to a 3 or whatever the case may be. And observations, once you're teaching, are not always all that useful anyway, depending on who's doing the observation. It's not teachers, it's typically administrators.
There's quite a bit of literature in the teacher education research that has been, the researchers have been examining what happens when a teacher and a mentor sit down and watch a video of teaching together and say, hey, what were you thinking when you did that? Or can you tell me more about what happened there with that student? Or, that sort of stimulated recall type of technique is actually really beneficial for both the administrator even to understand what the teacher was thinking and what they're doing and to understand their practice, and for the teacher to be unpacking their practice verbally in real time, saying, oh yeah, wow, I didn't notice that in my video before, and having to talk it through with a mentor or someone who's evaluating their teaching. You're right, because otherwise we don't really write about our teaching to explain it. It's very much a praxis. We're doing it. Teaching is a doing thing. We don't sort of stop. We do stop to reflect about what worked and what didn't work. And that's often really well supported in the research with doing these types of video observations and watching our own teaching back, rather than sending it off to someone else who watches 2 10-minute videos. Let's say in the edTPA, you send 2 of your best 10 minutes teaching, and that gets evaluated with how well it matches the lesson planning that you did. So it's very disjointed in that respect compared to a stimulated recall. Let's watch the lesson together, with maybe a mentor or even if it is someone evaluating, but to talk through the practice.
So with your written documentation, do you necessarily have to send your writing before you send the videos, or could you alter your lesson planning and all of the supporting writing after you film the videos so that it matches what you're seeing?
Technically, yeah, that would be considered, I think, a stronger presentation of materials, where if you plan, the pre-service students are asked to plan 3 to 5 lessons, and then they can choose. So ideally, they would film all of those lessons, the 3 to 5 lessons that they've planned, that they've submitted as a documentation. Then they would also film them and then find the best parts of the videos to say, here is where I was really meeting my students' needs. Here is where I identified that students needed support for their musical language, identifying places in the video where, that had matched what you were trying to do in the learning environment with what you had planned to do in the learning environment. So it is a matter of sort of, you can almost backwards design it and choose the best bits of the videos to match the bits of the lesson plan. And if maybe they didn't go so well, you can either write about that in the reflection and then say, I didn't do exactly what I thought I was going to be doing in this lesson, but here's some other things that evidence, my skill as a teacher. But there is sort of a more of a curation approach where pieces are put together to illustrate the overall competence of teaching. Whereas in real life teaching, it's very temporal. It goes by and we think about what just happened and we go on, we've got another class that's coming next or tomorrow, and we adjust our lesson plans sequentially that way rather than this backwards design that you could do, I suppose, in the edTPA. we try to create a body of portfolio of evidence and artifacts that show somehow that you're teaching what you said you were going to teach.
Right. Yeah. And so if you're able to, I'm thinking of all the ways in which this is not even sort of reflective of the assessments that you're headed into once you start teaching, like once you get the job. The formal observation structure, you can't go back and curate your lesson plan in such a way as to make it look more like what actually was seen in your teaching. And in the regular school day, your best 10 minutes don't mean anything if you had, if the other 40 minutes in the class are terrible. You don't really you don't ever really get to have a best 10 minutes if the other 40 minutes are bad.
That's right. And in the edTPA too, when they're looking at the videos, they are looking for specific things, like your subject specific knowledge, that you're somehow encouraging students to learn more deeply, that you're engaging with students. And the research has not been quite clear on what is engagement. What does it look like in a classroom? It looks really different, even just from an outside lens in. So when we're asking people to explain to us, tell us, well, in the edTPA, how are you engaging students? What does that mean? Are they engaged in just participating? Are they engaged in critical thinking? What are they engaged in? in the lesson, and sometimes that's not immediately clear when we're doing that in our classrooms. So sort of setting up that learning environment to help folks understand what we're doing in that space can be difficult because the pre-service teacher is in the classroom of another teacher. So often they haven't got any control of that environment or of the pedagogy being used because the cooperating teacher is the licensed, professional experienced person in the classroom, and often says to the student teacher, let's do it my way. So the student teacher, the pre-service teacher, isn't making those choices, and so sometimes can't explain the best parts of a lesson because they didn't necessarily choose those parts of the lesson. They were following a good model, and so they need to sort of explain, well, what was happening in that video, both for themselves and for the scorers, when in fact they might not have made those decisions wholly 100% themselves.
Right. They sort of had it's like bringing a cheat sheet into the assessment, one that you, in this case, don't really have a choice as to whether you're using it or not. Mm-hmm. So I'm having thought through all of the sort of structural faults with edTPA, or at least a few of the structural faults. I'm sure there are more, as there are with so many standardized assessments. I'm wondering what the precursor to edTPA was here in New York, or in general. What kinds of assessments were used prior to this standardized version?
Well, there were a couple of sort of state versions. There was a version in California that sort of started this all off. When they noticed some improvement in the math scores of students, where teachers had deliberately gone in and looked at their teaching and in this manner of their lesson plans and their videos and their sort of attention to assessment of students' learning, but it was more circular. You could go back between the three. It wasn't that you had these three discrete chunks that we have in edTPA now. But the precursor in the field is student teaching, the experience itself, where there's a real person that comes and sits in your classroom and talks to you about your teaching. And they do that multiple times. And it's the difference there is that it's used formatively, so that students can inform their teaching and they can improve, rather than what the edTPA is just at the end. And even though there is some growth that can occur from reflecting and looking at your teaching videos, you get a score, you just get a number and it goes to the state and you've passed your exam. There's nothing, you don't really get the feedback that says, oh, well, when you did that particular thing with that student, it might have been more successful if you had slowed down or sat beside them. There's nothing formative or that informs the person taking the test how to do it better. So the idea is to sort of present the best picture of your teaching in the one portfolio. But previous to edTPA, we've sort of moved in the field, at least in music. The student teaching was the real authentic assessment. Can you go into a classroom and teach children with some supporting people there with you, the cooperating teacher and someone coming from the university? So that was it. But then as things have progressed over the years, now we have to, there's additional tests that illustrate our content knowledge. So do we know our discipline? There's also tests that examine our beliefs around educating all students, making sure that we're not biased, that we take an inclusive approach to teaching, which is a way of maybe getting at the beliefs of teachers. Years ago, they were trying to measure the personality of teachers. Surely there was a special type of person that should be a teacher. But all of this, states want to make sure that teachers are ready when they do enter the field, and certainly having 15 weeks practicing teaching in a classroom with another professional teacher is essential. We've also got these other tests that we have to have students take before, during, and at the end now of their whole preparation as teachers. So the entry tests are things like sort of lower division university math, English, science, language sort of content areas that all teachers are entering the field with a basic knowledge of math, basic knowledge of history, basic knowledge of those things. And then if you're going into those areas, you take different tests that test a deeper knowledge of those discipline areas and the information and what you would be sharing as a teacher. And then obviously there's this sort of last standardized barrier or gatekeeper that supposedly measures readiness for teaching, but it doesn't. What measures readiness for teaching is doing it for 15 weeks with a real live, support person in the room and 80 to 150 real live students.
Right. So and student teaching has not gone away. That's still a part of teacher preparation. And I think everybody would agree it's a very important part of teacher preparation that, if anything, should be longer and should involve, a more gradual release of responsibility to student teachers becoming teachers. But so if that didn't go away, but the test was added, that means that there are basically two assessments at this point doing the same work, right? We've got an assessment that's built into student teaching, which is that formative quality of assessment, but then there's that summative at the end that doesn't involve any feedback, that just involves sort of the a portfolio being sent off, and then either a thumbs up or a thumbs down, or in the form of a numerical cutoff coming back and then being transmitted to the state.
Yeah, so it's almost as if, that the states don't trust the higher education institutions to prepare students. And certainly, some institutions prepare their teachers differently to others, and that's the way it should be. Some prepare them more fully, others prepare them less fully. It depends where students go after graduation, where they want to teach. There's some researchers suggest that if students do their student teaching in an area where they see themselves teaching in the future, that tends to retain teachers, and they invest more in the process of that student teaching experience. So if someone's really passionate about teaching in a particular, like Title I school, for example, if they're placed there for their student teaching, they're more likely to take a job again after they've graduated in a Title I school, and they see themselves doing that work and they stay there and they're successful. But it is tied to some of the education policy that was enacted back under with Arnie Duncan back two administrations ago. And, looking at the quality of teaching in general. So there was a lot more sort of federal interest in how well a teacher's teaching and why aren't students doing the things that, they should be doing. And so as part of that movement, sort of an accountability movement, not only were the evaluations of current teachers really changed dramatically, where people were coming in and evaluating them and using big rubrics to evaluate current teachers, that also moved down a step into the preparation of teachers, where they felt that a more systematic, standardised way of assessing teacher readiness could be this thing called the edTPA. And of course, the folks that make the edTPA, a company called Pearson, thought that was great, because if every new teacher has to take this test, that's, enormously lucrative. And so certainly lots of states were able to say, look, we can increase the quality of our graduating teachers by them taking this test. But we know that continual testing doesn't improve the quality of anything necessarily. It's a bit of a revenue maker, particularly for Pearson in those states where they have agreements that they will provide the standardised test for gateway into the field. And so their test is purported to measure that, whether they are literally ready for the job. And I don't necessarily think that that assessment shows readiness. Other things do show readiness, but maybe that assessment doesn't. And it maybe acts as a bit of a fail-safe if somehow the student teaching wasn't as rigorous as it should have been, if the experience wasn't rich and diverse and educative for the pre-service teacher. Maybe the edTPA acts as a bit of a secondary sort of quality check. But in lots of cases, in lots of states it's required. I can't remember how many states it's required in now, but still required in New York.
Certainly in New York, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And that's not just in music, that's across all teaching disciplines, elementary all the way through to high school. Just a lot of teachers every year.
A lot of teachers, a lot of tests, and each test is, I think, $300 if I remember correctly. Mm-hmm. So that times the number of new teachers entering the profession every year, that is the revenue that's going to Pearson, which is a publicly traded for-profit company that has massive contracts, not just in edTPA, but in lots of other standardized tests in the field of education as well. Mm-hmm. And so, it would make sense that so if you don't trust teacher preparation, if you are a legislator who just doesn't trust teacher preparation, or wants to prove that you're creating a very rigorous environment for pre-service teachers before they can enter the field, give them a test, give them a very good test that will measure their capacities for teaching to make sure that you're not sending unprepared teachers into the field. Mm-hmm. But once the money question enters the picture, it sort of changes the landscape a little bit, I would think, in that this is a for-profit company that is facilitating this, and none of the money that goes towards the edTPA that a student teacher pays out of pocket before they have gotten a job, none of that is going anywhere other than to Pearson. Is that right?
As far as I know, that's right. That's the nature of the business, and educational measurement has been criticised, for a long time about that. Other exams like this are the GRE or the SATs, that measure quote unquote student learning. Whether that's true or not, it certainly measures students' knowledge on any given day about any given topic. And so none of that money sort of comes back. And New York, on the one hand, I can see trying to do the right thing. They're trying to prepare really good teachers because New York is a big state and there's lots of diversity between, counties and districts and even school buildings. So having teachers that are really well prepared is very important. And I think New York has some of the most amounts of tests and the highest cut scores for these tests in an effort to make sure that teachers entering the field are really ready. So maybe it's just a matter of, more is better. And that you can see that rationale on the one hand, but on the other hand, also New York wants to increase the diversity of its teaching workforce, and not everyone can afford all of this barrage of tests throughout their degree, no matter where they take their degree, whether they're doing their teacher preparation, at a public institution or a private institution. The cost of the degree, notwithstanding, it can cost almost $800 for these tests. For every single person, trying to get a license to teach in New York.
And that's if you pass.
Right. Yes. And it's interesting because a lot of folks will say, well, we have 100% pass rate. All of our students graduating have passed all of their exams, but that's because they have to get the certificate. So if you don't pass it, you have to take it again till you pass it. Otherwise, these 4 years or 5 years you've been studying to say, let's say, be a math teacher, you won't be able to do that if you can't make sure that you've got a passing score for all of these exams. So New York, I think, has done a good job in trying to mediate that a little bit by offering these safety nets. So you can take a less expensive test that technically illustrates the similar content or knowledge, and helps folks continue into the workforce, and obviously, still quite high standards. But not everything can be measured in a test or an assessment, right?
Right. And so what are some ways that you can hack the test, the edTPA, so that you get your points without actually having to demonstrate any proficiency in teaching? Whenever I think about a test that doesn't actually measure the thing it's supposed to measure, I'm thinking of the ways that you can turn in just a completely outlandish example of the assessment in order to pass without having actually learned the material.
Absolutely, yeah. If you're you take maybe sort of a more Taylorian approach to teaching, right, where A is first, B is second, C is third, which is different really to teaching, which is everything's happening all at once and different students need different things at different times across the space of 90 minutes. But let's say, yes, planning is important. You do have to have some sense of what you're going to teach. You can look at the rubric, and in that sense, it is good because you can see what the goal is. So in the 3 sections, there's planning. You want to make sure that your lessons build on each other. So you do a simple lesson, then a more complicated lesson, and then you save the advanced lesson for the 3rd lesson, so that there is a sequential building of difficulty or complexity across the 3 classes. Now, you might not teach that over 3 classes with real students. That might take you 9 classes, but there's a perception that if you build 3, or they should be sequentially building up upon each other. So that would be one thing. Whereas in reality, your first 3 lessons, it's here's an idea, let's go back and review the idea. Here's the idea again with one new thing. We're not building that level of complexity often over just the 3 lessons. But you could do that if it looked sequential. You really do have to sort of read the rubric, and what they're looking for is tying objectives, to the one focus that you wanted to be teaching across those 3 lessons. So you have to make sure the objectives are really clear, that they're tied, linguistically as well as content-wise to the overarching goals that you have, and that you have thought about all the learners in your classroom, and what would they need to meet those goals.
Differentiating.
Yeah, exactly.
Learning.
Yeah.
Okay.
And being able to say, these are my students. I know that these 5 students need this particular thing. I know this student needs something different. And being able to sort of map that into a theory, right? Or something that in teaching, we really do value this idea of taking, theory into practice. But if you talk about the theory in, say, one of your lesson plans or one of your commentaries, they're called, about your lesson plans, if you can throw in a few theorists that think this is a good idea, what you're doing in your lesson plan, that is sort of a false indication that you are justifying your performance using research. Whereas, it's probably not just name dropping. You do need to understand the research and the theory. But yeah, there's that kind of thing. So even if you didn't enact it well in the classroom, you could write about the theory that supports why you would have chose to do that in the classroom. So yeah, always, like most things, looking at the goals, looking at what the rubric is free, is available in all the different areas for folks to look at. So that would be one way to do that. Look at what are they looking for. Let me make that abundantly clear in my artifacts and my commentaries and the work that I'm turning in on that. So that would be one way to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, just go down the list and make sure that each of these things are there, and drag and drop a theorist, and hope that the theoretical framework matches what you have written.
Mm-hmm. And the same would be for the videos as well. There's a section, the learning environment, the second section, where if there's always a section called look fors, which is what the scorer is looking for. So make sure those things are in there so that they can be seen. And so then it starts to feel really performative, right? It's just like, I'm just picking the best bits out of my lesson plans and the best bits out of my teaching. And it's perhaps, not comprehensive. I'm just, picking up the best bits, which is really what the test is asking you to do. Whereas in teaching, my colleague Bob Fetshow always talks about wobble moments. Teachers, even 20 years into their profession, often have wobble moments, which is, the thing I was trying to do just didn't work. And I wasn't successful, but those are the things that make us better as teachers. And in fact, those should be the things, show me your worst teaching and tell me what you learned about it would be a really interesting way to measure that. But that's what happens in student teaching, in that experience every day with the cooperating teacher who says, that's okay. Here's, let's try it again tomorrow, or the next class is coming in 5 minutes. Let's try it again. So teaching isn't about that.
Mm-hmm. In order to make this a stronger lesson, what is the thing that was missing there, that where once you drop that into the lesson, it'll work better.
Yeah, and knowing that. And sometimes novice teachers or new teachers, it takes them a minute to be able to figure that out. It's like, oh yeah, I should have done X, Y, or Z. And then more experienced teachers can figure it out quite quickly, and they pivot very quickly, and they can tell when something's not working based on experience. There's not a magic menu. There's not a magic recipe for this. It's like a sense of knowing the students in front of you and recognizing what you're doing isn't working and changing in a split second. And that's really the difference between a new teacher and an experienced teacher.
Right. It's sort of like a set of muscles that you have to train in order to be able to get that response right away, as opposed to needing to take an entire unit to realize, like, oh, I shouldn't have started with that. You can, figure it out on a smaller time scale, like a lesson time scale, or like a split second time scale. Like, oh, this is where I pivot and fix this now. And that's just not part of the edTPA. It seems like.
No, there's not really scope for that. They're not looking for, that moment when things weren't going well and you fixed it. They're looking for, planned lessons, engaged teaching, and reflection about what students have learned using assessments in the classroom, which, in different fields, classroom assessments have not often been used, just because they're up to the teacher to design, and not every teacher knows how to design an activity or an assessment task in the classroom that will let them see what their students know and can do. So in one sense, the edTPA does encourage that. So, for teachers to figure out ways to really understand what their students are trying to tell them, and maybe not rely on standardized tests or SATs as measures of teaching. Those are just measures of knowledge accrued across a period of time. But if you want to know what happened, with my students today, asking them to write an exit slip on the way out to say, here's what I learned this today, but I still need to know more about something else, or can we do something entirely different tomorrow, just to understand where students are every day. That's very informal, but it's a type of classroom assessment that lets teachers into how their students are doing. We don't have to wait till mid-semester to give a test, and it can be part of instruction. We don't have to stop and then do assessments in the classroom. Often an assessment can be this really cool, fun activity that then teachers can take and reflect and look over before planning their next lesson to see where students are and where they need to go to next. And I don't think, the edTPA does allow for a little bit of that, looking into how teachers are measuring their students' learning in the classroom. So that bit I'm okay with. But it seems an awfully expensive lesson to learn, when it could just be part of, as it is, for example, at Teachers College, helping students as they're learning to become teachers, how to learn to measure their students' knowledge as they go. It's part of their education. But it may be in other schools that's not the same. Maybe they need the edTPA to help them get those skills happening.
Everything that the edTPA does can be done really well and sort of on the cheap, or if not on the cheap, then at least without having to bring in a corporation in order to check.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, I advocated for that in that, it's not without its merit, but it shouldn't cost a student $300 to get no feedback. And it's not a measure of their readiness for teaching. The steps in the edTPA are, they're useful as part of preparation to become a teacher. And some states, Missouri has a state test. It's called the MOPAT, which means that a section of it is scored only by the university, and then the rest of it is sent to be scored by a standardized set of scorers. So there is more of that sort of, okay, let's look at what you did. Here's some feedback in real time, and let's improve our teaching. And then, then the other sections I think are sent off in an attempt to sort of give the student more formative knowledge so that their teaching can improve, which is what happens during student teaching. Each time the student is observed or, talks to their cooperating teacher, we don't have to wait till the end of the semester to do this. We're always filming ourselves in our clinical practices and our classroom experiences. We're always reflecting, asking questions, what worked, what didn't, what do I need to know about my students, and looking at our videos of our teaching. Because I would say to do that at the end, if that's the only time that it's being done, is too late anyway.
Right. The students don't benefit from, the students don't get anything out of a teacher learning after the fact that they should have done something differently.
Right. Mm-hmm.
The formative process is really how you bring the benefit of reflective practice to students.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And you can ask students as well. The student voice is nowhere in the edTPA. So the K-12 student voice is nowhere in that. No one asks the K-12 student, what does this teacher do well? What would you like this teacher to do better? And the K-12 student voice is really important as well. They're co-learning. literally in those settings. And there's been a move to do that more, I think, in higher education. We see that where students, complete evaluations about their professors, not so much in K-12 and certainly not in preparing new teachers.
A big group of stakeholders to be leaving out is the ones who are really supposed to be at the center of what's happening here, even as you're preparing a new teacher. So there's in this sort of like student/teacher role. Mm-hmm. The goal in the end is for the students to get something out of the process. So I'm thinking about why make it about writing in the edTPA? Well, you do it as writing because that's something that you can kind of standardize a little bit. But it doesn't, in standardizing it, you sort of lose all of the good and important things that you're looking for, right? You even change the operative verb from teaching to writing. And so you really lose a lot in standardizing it. But you have to, in order to make it so that you can, because you want it standardized. And when I say you, I'm really, of course, talking about policymakers here, and people who are consulted when policymakers need to invent a new policy. So in creating this assessment that can be standardized, you sort of lose the purpose for the assessment, which is to measure teacher practice. So it would seem to me that anybody who is a real stakeholder and not a policymaker who's sort of making choices that are supposed to be to the benefit of stakeholders, but may not actually in fact be, it seems that we should be resisting this in the field as teachers who are in practice, as teachers who are pre-service, as individuals involved in teacher preparation. It seems like we should be trying to, we shouldn't like this. And the audience might have formed a different opinion, who knows, but probably most of us shouldn't want this. So what are some of the things we can do?
Well, some of the things that I've done in my capacity is written about it, sort of critical pieces, and to talk to policymakers. So when decisions are being made about the use of the edTPA, going down to town hall and taking my 3 minutes on the green light and explaining from my research why we shouldn't use it as a gateway into teaching, pointing out the flaws. So there's those sorts of things. Often at the policy level, these things come up for review often, and there'll be a public comment period that says, in the higher ed Board of Regents will say, we're considering, for example, removing the GRE requirement for entry into teacher preparation programs. So obviously, when we see that, we all send a letter and say, please, reconsider, and using those opportunities to give feedback during any open comment periods. So it does mean always looking for anything new legislatively that is coming up, changes that are being made by the Board of Regents about teacher preparation, keeping an eye on those things. At Teachers College, we have a really strong sort of advocacy group where we'll make a postcard and all of our students will write on it, and we will post 500 postcards up to Albany to help get our message through. So it's advocacy, and as with all sort of legislative change or policy making, you've got to be part of the conversation and making sure that that all the information about it is out there. So we're working hard on that. Teachers College, I think, wrote one of the first letters against the use of the edTPA in 2013, it was, 2012, 2013. So literally using your voice, getting together. But for students who are in programs, at the moment it's still required. And we are, often there's lots of institutions around New York that would rather, show and evidence our students' ability and preparedness to teach in many other richer and more interesting ways. But yeah, so we're often in dialogue, with the Board of Regents, with the Chancellor, just to keep those lines of communications open as the field dramatically changes. That the pressure and accountability has changed a little bit, in that we're graduating highly effective and highly prepared teachers. So there's less of that accountability piece now. It's more about sort of quality. But as we've just experienced with the pandemic, teaching online is very different to teaching in person. And so how do we prepare our teachers to be ready for the next pandemic, which I'm sure is around the corner. But, with what we've learned in this last year and a half, that's changed the field. It's changed how we prepare our teachers, and the types of things. So luckily, over the last year and a half, they have removed the edTPA requirement for students who were doing student teaching over the last year and a half, just because they weren't able to put the requirements together. So that also exposed sort of a flaw, that it's less like, well, teaching happens in different ways, not just only in the prescriptive way that it is supposed to be evidenced in the edTPA.
Right. And so if the test doesn't work in one of the many authentic environments in which teaching is taking place, then how can you call it a good tool?
That's the question we are all asking. Or at least, what I've written about. And lots of folks, raised the issue. I would say in the last decade, there's been a lot of research conducted around the edTPA, looking at the measure itself, looking at some of the reported reliabilities and validities of the, it's called an instrument as a measure, as an assessment, looking at the experiences of teachers who've had to try to go through it, who've tried to pass it, and the use of it in general, as a gatekeeping kind of mechanism, which is problematic for many of our teachers trying to enter the field.
Right. And I would imagine that the standardized nature of the test is, it's one of the flaws of the test, but it also makes it very easy to point out where systemic flaws are taking place. So like if it is gatekeeping, but only in a very particular way, I would think that the data would sort of bear that out. Is that what folks are finding as more data emerges over the course of, however many years the edTPA has been in place?
Mm-hmm. Yep, they do publish a report every year, and I will say I have not read this year's report yet. But last year's report, it indicated what we know about the problem in the field already. That it is not the teaching workforce, and the future workforce that we're preparing is not nearly as diverse as it needs to be. Yeah. And so we see, like other standardized tests as well, that white students typically have different scores to students of colour coming through, and that is in no way representative of their ability to take and pass the test. It's much more indicative of internal biases in the test, and then when they're questioned, because the numbers are so disparate, there's this 90% of the teachers are white and 10% of teachers, maybe in music education, but not in other fields. Maybe it's more like 82 to 18%. It's very difficult to mathematically or statistically compare those two sets of populations because they're so different in size. So there's an immediate, we can't compare because of the population size. I'm like, but that's the problem in the field.
Right. You just identified the problem. It doesn't matter the comparison once you run the statistics. The problem is the difference in population size.
Exactly. We need more access for folks wanting to become teachers just across the board, particularly in New York. And having tests like the edTPA just make it harder. Not because people can't pass it, but it's an unnaturally expensive barrier, and it doesn't do what it's purporting to do, which is indicate readiness for teaching. It tells us how well we can write about teaching, really, and how well we can choose to put things together in a pretty package. in a way.
Right. Well,
but I'll keep writing about it. I'm going to keep checking in with the legislation, and there's scope for change, I think. But I think also it's enormously profitable for Pearson. So it's hard to wind that clock back in a sense now that it's really moving.
Right. Advocacy would have to equal that $300 per student that is acting as an incentive for a company that has more than enough, resource base to advocate on its own behalf.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, folks in higher ed, we're doing what we can, which is doing the research and exposing the bias and some of the limitations. And, eventually hoping to have conversations at state levels with our state education departments about the requirements for student teaching, whether it's, law or legislation or policy. It's important to be always asking to have those conversations. And I'm, really glad that a school like Teachers College does that. And we hope that in that sense we're making it, leading the field and helping other institutions that perhaps don't have that time or that opportunity to be helping make this pathway into teaching not easier, but more equitable.
Right. Well, I think we're probably at time. Thank you so much for joining us and for imparting your wisdom and sharing all this stuff to be thinking about as we're thinking about teacher preparation and the gatekeeping. And we are the podcast is pro bringing people into the field and all sorts of people, not just the people who are most likely to have an easy time with the edTPA. So
right.
So it's great to have some evidence-based commentary.
Well, you're very welcome. I'm happy to chat anytime. And if your listeners are looking for more materials, I will send them to you. And I'm sure there'll be a link to click or something for keeping an eye or getting more information. So I'll be sure to make sure you have that.
We'll put that in the show notes in the description. So folks, feel free to peruse away. All right. Thanks again, Dr. Parks, for being here. I really appreciate it.
Great. Thanks. I really enjoyed it.